Hello everyone and welcome to my YouTube channel Why Not Daily Spoiler. Kyle loses control. Gladys marries bombshell.
Liar, Claire is your wife. Kyle attacks Holden after Claire's secret marriage is exposed. Claire had perfected her grin all week. It sat on her like an accessory, sleek and professional. Her mind, however, had been a storm. Even as people applauded her grant proposal notes and requested another champagne flute, she felt as if she were being followed by an unidentified shadow. Secrets are like little impatient animals that can be heard breathing once their existence is acknowledged. No one spotted the envelope at first. It arrived between speeches, passing through a maze of food personnel to a woman with only a diary and a desire for scandal. Phyllis Summers, who enjoyed a good theatrical reveal nearly as much as Claire despised melodrama, had been constrained by familial obligations. She came to the gala wearing a gown that announced to the press that she had been forgiven for her past misdeeds, and she started looking for an advantage. She found it. The envelope was tiny, shiny, and exact. A marriage certificate was inside, on official-looking parchment. State of New Jersey, Certificate of Marriage. The names were typed in clear cursive. Claire Jean Ellis, the Claire who had married Kyle 5 years ago, and Holden Snyder. Phyllis's gasp echoed wonderfully over the clink of cutlery. Her voice connected with the nearest microphone like a fish on a line. "Is that?" she inquired loudly enough to divide the room in half. Claire felt it the same way you would experience a quick drop on a roller coaster, a stomach leap, and the unrelated sensation that your teeth are weak. She turned toward the sound. Her palm grabbed Kyle's sleeve, and for a brief while, the simple pressure kept her steady. Just a moment earlier, he was smiling at one of the board members. He didn't yet know. Phyllis, with the delightful malice of a woman who considers herself the city's moral arbiter, clutched the paper like an emblem. "Look," she said. "Everyone look. Isn't it interesting what turns up in envelopes?" Heads turned. The audience of philanthropists and socialites leans toward spectacle in the same way as flowers do toward the sun. Someone launched the camera app on their phone. The gala faded into a whisper of startled breaths. Kyle's face became frigid in the same manner that the horizon does before a storm. He walked toward Phyllis, as if he were responding to an allegation about his own life. His jaw was wire. "Phyllis," he asked, politely and sharply, "what's that?" Phyllis smiled the way she did when she wanted someone to feel humiliated and appreciative for the attention. "A focused piece of truth, Kyle." She held the certificate up to him. Then across the room, Claire Abbott, registered as Claire Snyder in a civil ceremony 6 months ago. A private registry. Signed in Atlantic City. Witnessed by Henry Markham. The room was unaware of the background. All it suspected was betrayal. Phones rose like little, hungry birds. Holden's name landed in the air like a flung stone. Holden, who had been tending a table of contributors and unknowingly spreading his warm charm like a guy who made comfort his ministry, tensed. He examined the paper, wondering whether it was papier-mâché. The dawning reality of recognition washed over his face. "Claire," he spoke with a scratchy voice. He had previously been stupid enough to believe that secrets might be hidden in the bones of those who enjoyed creating privacy. He hadn't considered Phyllis's appetite. Claire's throat closed. Heat surged, then cooled. She felt the eyes of everyone she'd ever harmed or admired puncture her like theatrical knives. Kyle reached for her hand and then withdrew it, as if the touch might burn him. "Kyle," Claire began. She had already prepared confessions. Brief ones for trivial matters of taste or business. It was a different gravity. She could hear her own heartbeat through the room's silence. "Please let me explain." But Kyle did not want explanations. In some ways, he'd been preparing for this moment all week, not the content, but the risk that the foundation he'd created may crumble. His face, once calm and reasonable, trembled with a kind of personal betrayal that went deeper than public humiliation. It was the betrayal of being fooled in the most intimate currency there is, marital faithfulness, the private contract of 2 lives. "You lied to me," he replied simply. "The accusation was a lance. You married him." Claire's eyes widened, and she felt the edges of truth fray. "It wasn't like that." "You were my wife," Kyle snapped. "We made vows." We have a life. You didn't tell me you were legally bound to another man. You. Claire's words faltered under his heat. She tried to pull the context curtain over the moment, but it tore all at once. This wasn't private anymore. It was nothing. It was a mistake. It occurred during a separation. I was terrified. I figured if I helped Holden. Phyllis, ecstatic with her revelation, had already leaned in with a torch. Holden was once a charity case. Claire, you married him to what? To keep him silent. To turn yourself into a hero? Can you have your cake and eat it too? No, Claire replied, barely audible. The city's deception caused her tongue to become clunky. It was a private matter. It wasn't intended to harm anyone. Kyle's face became a cold instrument. The old treachery, a different headline the previous year, gleamed in his eyes like a scar. Not intended to injure anyone? You married my husband. His voice was harsh. There was no room for politeness. Holden stepped forward before they could simmer. He had no desire for firearms in the foyer of his conscience. He'd never intended to be the type of man whose name caused controversy. But he was drawn into concealment before he realized the consequences. Kyle, Holden said gently, hands open. I realize that you are angry, but there are reasons. You don't get to justify this, Kyle retorted. You're not even family here. The word family cracked. Claire's lips shook as a new thought dawned on her. She had married Holden with her private self outside the system. Legally, the city now recognized a tie she had kept hidden, and the secrecy had cost her the single honest thing she'd built into her life, Kyle's complete trust. Kyle then committed an act that he later described as a lack of control, both to friends and in private. He pushed forward, not verbally, but physically, and shoved Holden back so hard that a donor's glass tipped and fell on the floor like a broken clock. The attack was animalistic, with the image of a man betrayed by love more agonizing than the loss itself. Hands soared. Security scrambled. A couple men crossed to keep Kyle back as he tugged at Holden's collar, spewed words like little blades. You liar. Kyle barked. You lie, you worm. You took her. You took. Holden's face was a picture of surprise. He had imagined rage, tears, and court papers, but not the physical rawness of a stranger who felt robbed of the life he had expected. The evening sank into an auditorium of astonishment. Guests sprang to their feet, cameras panned, and someone screamed for order. Jack Abbott resembled an emergency escape. The elder Abbott stood between Kyle and Holden, instinctively protecting his son's silhouette while addressing his own. That's enough, Kyle, he said, his voice sounding like a gavel. Kyle's shaky hand caught the back of a chair, which he used as leverage to pull himself away. The look he gave Holden was both a promise and a menace. The room's whispers coalesced into 100 micro-opinions. Someone yelled for the cops. Someone else mumbled about divorce lawyers and custody hearings. The cameras, dutiful and eager, recorded every viewpoint. Claire staggered back, as if struck. Her expression was shocked in a new way. The realization that her secret, a personal deed designed to safeguard something she couldn't even explain to herself, had exploded into the public's terrible theater. Holden was at the center of it all, blinking and suddenly very present in a life that would have wanted him to be absent. The repercussions were immediate. The tabloids pounced on the tale like predators handed choice meat. Liar, is Claire your wife? One headline screamed. Hollywood meets Genoa, secret marriage shock. Another person yelled. Friends texted and lawyers called. Ashley attempted to assuage funders with corporate apologies. Jack drove Kyle home, where fatherly hands and a scuffed old recliner attempted to cradle a guy whose image of marriage had been shattered. Kyle didn't sleep that night, not for the guilt or humiliation, which burnt like acid, but for the knowledge that the woman he loved had chosen secret above honesty. He recalled minor details that now appeared to be evidence. The late evenings Claire had spent taking calls in the study, the way she had been distant and then suddenly warm, and a weekend she had claimed was for work rather than a trip to the courts. Each memory has been reorganized into categories, similar to how files on a desktop are organized into new folders. In comparison, Holden was both stoic and perplexed. He returned to his humble flat in a neighborhood that tolerated fewer pretenses. His buddies called, distraught with worry. He explained haltingly that the marriage had been hasty, a temporary refuge in a time when both he and Claire feared loss. They had been separated, the emotional chasm growing from small to large, and they had married one night in Atlantic City because the thought of someone else taking you away was worse than the thought of starting a lie. He had assumed it would remain personal. He had been wrong. But reality in Genoa City has teeth. It hurts and bleeds. The brutal and opportunistic legal industry sniffed out documents that could be utilized, prenuptial agreements, asset implications, and tax consequences. Devon contacted within hours the type of lawyer whose mind sees both acquisitions and sick human equations of trust. Kyle, Devon replied softly, you can contest a marriage on the grounds of duress if she was not of sound mind. You can investigate the certificate's validity, and you can file for annulment. But first, follow Bradley's rules. Secure the child, preserve the company, and avoid public retribution. There was a youngster in this drama, constantly on the periphery. Connor, Kyle, and Claire's son, who was pure and unconscious of adult permutations. Claire's deepest worry was not public embarrassment, but that Connor would grow up in a house split by lies. During the frenzied hours, she alternated between wanting to explain and wanting to shrink. She could see Holden on the outskirts of every decision. They both had to gather up the bits they had shattered of each other. Claire accomplished something unique for a soap character. She pursued honesty in form, if not outcome. The next morning, she organized a news conference. Her publicist requested spin. Keep it calm, the publicist advised. We can treat this as a private mistake. No melodrama. Claire didn't want spin. She desired clean air. She stood on the dais with the poise of someone who was accustomed to being photographed. The microphones leaned in, like birds. Flashbulbs popped. She took a deep breath and revealed the truth to the fullest extent she could. I married Holden during a period when Kyle and I were separated, she remarked steadily, the words hitting hard. It was impulsive and private. It was an error. I kept it a secret because I felt ashamed. I believed I could shield them from harm. I was wrong. The audience started to shift. Why did you lie? A reporter exclaimed. Fear, Claire said, and for a little moment that was enough. Fear that the truth will destroy my family. Fear of injuring Kyle. Fear that painful situations will never be contained. I made the wrong decision. Kyle looked at the television in his study and wanted to trust the voice. He wanted the lady who had married him in front of the minister and vowed to bring 3 small lives together to be the woman on the dais. However, he also had the image of the certificate, the pain of the assault on Holden, and a man's injured dignity. Kyle did something that garners both attention and consequence in soap towns. He filed for an immediate annulment of the marriage, as well as the establishment of custody safeguards pending court findings. The judicial system, deliciously literal, moved at the pace of paperwork and the slowness of human hearts. There were depositions. The certificate was independently reviewed. When contacted, the registrar in Atlantic City admitted a limited ceremony, but insisted on the authenticity of the signatures. There were witnesses. There were also other missing features, such as no vows recorded in a church, no public images, and no reception. In quiet settings, people talked about motive. Phyllis maintained that the marriage was a ruse, a ploy for Claire to divert attention away from her financial failures and gain sympathy. Devon examined the document's forensics and concluded that the ink indicated that the certificate was signed in haste, a rushed line that contradicted years of planning. Holden, tired, informed friends that there had been no plan, only terror. There was also a private and intimate narrative that no camera could capture. One night, Kyle drove himself to Holden's flat. I'm not here to fight, he replied as Holden opened the door. The 2 men stared at each other like 2 animals in the dark, assessing harm and solutions. Holden's face was raw from nights of torment. I didn't mean to hurt you, Holden explained. Claire and I, it was a moment. We both panicked. We both should have been braver. We were not. Kyle's jaw constricted into a map of options. He thought of his son's little hands. You married my wife. "I married a woman I loved in a moment of foolishness," Holden recalled. "Not your wife, of course. We weren't together at the time. But the label on the paper belongs to you, because she never told you. I get how that appears. I never dreamed we'd get into this." Kyle stared at Holden for a long time before something resembling the worst of man's options flashed across his mind. Fury may be used to hide fear. He wanted to be angry enough to cause the world to reorganize itself so that the pain would not be trapped inside his chest. Instead, he felt something strange, pity and the acidic agony of a man whose life is slipping through other people's hands. "Stay away from my son," Kyle finally said, "until this is resolved." For his sake, Holden nodded. "I'll do whatever helps the boy." The plot evolved into legal hearings, therapy sessions, and family dinners that felt like war councils. The public ultimately quieted down because human drama is never-ending, and the city is always looking for a newer scandal to swallow. However, those in the center were unable to leave the stage. Claire did something incredible in the weeks that followed. She embraced honesty not because it would save anything, but because a child's right to the truth was more important than her need to avoid pain. She complied with the legal counsel. She apologized to Kyle privately and signed the annulment petition herself, explaining that she entered the marriage while emotionally vulnerable and without the intent to establish a permanent marital relationship. She accepted to mediation. She consented to therapy. She stopped giving interviews to the tabloids. The tale had a cheap headline, but the quieter ending was more complicated. Kyle healed in a way that left scars that occasionally flare up in little disagreements about bedtime scheduling and then fade into shared gratitude for the small miracles of fatherhood. Holden, chastened, discovered compassion rather than pity. He became a neighbor rather than a lover, visiting Connor at soccer games and assisting with schoolwork without assuming the role of husband or father. Claire, finally transparent and free of the energy required to maintain a deception, is reconstructed with rusted tools. Phyllis had her moment in the theater of revenge, and then, as is often in Genoa City, she was abandoned by the next great drama. Her joy faded when she saw the human collateral, a child who had been the true casualty of broken marriage, and a man she'd laughed at who appeared to want to die in a way that made her throat tighten. Ultimately, there was no satisfying justice for the appetite for spectacle. There were only little unsatisfactory repairs performed by persons who had used each other and failed. Kyle forgave in degrees, but he did not forget. He reconstructed a marriage that resembled more of a partnership than a marriage, a new accord established in the emotional language of making promises all over again. Claire discovered that secrecy breeds ruin, and that the truth, even when detonated, can still be used to repair. Holden eventually found someone who loved him more openly. He married again, this time with witnesses and a band playing following the vows. He stayed in Connor's life, not as a shadow, but as a constant presence. And the incident at the gala, the shove, the scream, the cameras that blinked like ravenous creatures, became a paragraph in a larger existence. It was the moment when a private truth met a public appetite, demonstrating how costly such collisions are. But in the early hours, when Connor slept and the house hummed with the silence of people who realized how fragile things are, Claire and Kyle would stand in the kitchen and hold hands, awkward, hesitant, and human, and try, sometimes clumsily, sometimes effectively, to love again.